Hi, this is Danny Goldberg. How are you?
Hi, Danny. Great to chat to you. And where are you sitting now? What part of the States are you in?
I'm sitting in Manhattan. I hadn't come into my office since March, and then this week I'm coming in a few days. I've worked for years with Steve Earle, who just returned to the New York City because his younger son John Henry is back in school, so it's a chance to see him and me and a couple of my associates experimenting with actually working from the city. So this is my second day in 5 months in Manhattan,
It
West
must,
35th Street.
it must be a very strange feeling being back then after being away for so long.
Well, it's a strange time in general. I mean, the city looks a lot like New York City to me. Everybody's wearing masks. That's the main difference. I'm in an office all by myself right now, so I don't need to wear one.
Mm.
But you know, uh, it's no weirder than the rest of the world, and there's a certain reassuring thing, honestly, about just seeing this city that's been here through so many different eras and crises. So I'm kind of liking it. Again, it's a abnormal hours and still trying to figure out what we actually can do
Yeah.
because, of course, the like anybody who works with talent that does concerts, that business is 90% shut down. But we still have concerns about the future and our artist relationship with the media and recording is going on. So there's still some work. We've been doing it digitally. I don't know how long I'll keep a physical office here, but this lease goes till the end of the year. So
Use it while you can.
definitely will be here for the rest of this discussion.
Perfect. If I see the pictures moving behind you, I'll know that I know that you have to go somewhere else.
Yeah, yeah.
And come here to me. Tell me, the way I've started most of these conversations is asking people now, looking back at themselves as kids, were you always destined, to be in the music business? Was this something, was that something from a young age? Were you around the arts or creativity, or was that in your life?
Well, there's two parts to the question: is was I destined, and then did I feel that I was destined? I certainly had no idea that there was such a thing as the music business. When I was, I graduated from high school in 1967. There was no, I didn't know there was such a thing as a business. I just went to the record store and got a Bob Dylan record when a new one came out. It never occurred to me that there was a whole group of people that were working. I got a little clue when I saw that documentary about Dylan called Don't Look Back and saw Albert Grossman there. And he seemed to be in on all the jokes that Dylan, he seemed to be an insider. And I thought that's kind of cool, because I knew I had no musical ability at a young age. I tried piano lessons, anything like that. Couldn't do that. Couldn't sing on key. But I really didn't understand that there was a music business until I got a job with Billboard in the end of 1968, and that was a job I got because I just needed a job so I could afford my own apartment. And once I got there, I realized that it was a trade magazine primarily for the music business, that there was a music business, that there were all these other kinds of jobs, managers and record company jobs and publishers and promo people and publicists. And once I discovered that I could get free concert tickets and free records if I was quote unquote in the business, I definitely never wanted to leave, and I never have left. It's been 52 years since then. But when I was in school, I didn't know what I wanted to do. I just loved rock and roll. I was confused. It was a very psychedelic period for me. I really had no idea. But once I knew there was such a thing as the business, boy, I grabbed onto it. Once I got that free copy of the Beatles' White Album from the Capitol promo rep, what you would call a plugger for Christmas of '68, I thought I want to stay in this.
Well,
And that's still how I feel every day. I'm hanging on for dear life.
that's incredible. Sorry, yeah, just that must have been. I mean, obviously, it's an extraordinary experience now hearing someone telling you that you got the promo copy of the Beatles album. But at that stage, even at that stage, the Beatles were huge. So, like the sense of
Oh no, it was so exciting. I mean, of course, it was late in their career, and it was a double album. It would have been expensive. I forget what albums cost then, but that was like cash then. There was no streaming or downloads, and plus it was like the day it came out, you know. Yeah, I don't know that it was in a promo copy. It was just like a free copy. You know, maybe it had a hole drilled in it or something. I think they used to do that so that people wouldn't resell them, but you know, through the cover. But the main thing about it was that it was free.
Yeah. And community, at that stage, then you started writing, wasn't that was your journalism kind
Well,
of?
within a few months, yes. My original job at Billboard was clerical. They needed someone in what they called the chart department. And again, this was before barcodes. And the way the charts were compiled was they had 6 or 8, I forget, people like me spending all day calling record shops and asking them to list their top 10. And then we'd go through a checklist of singles and ask if they were selling heavy, medium, light, or not at all. And we did that 4 days a week, and then 1 day a week it was all compiled, and then there was an hour on, I forget what day of the week it was. I think it was Fridays when everybody would call. All the reps would call to find out where their record was on the chart early, because the magazine didn't come out till Monday, and so that answering the phones was part of it too. But I discovered that there were people on the other side of the office that were getting paid to go to concerts, which they got into for free, and just write their opinions about them. And I had not been a very good student in school. I never got along with my teachers. I wrote for the school newspaper, but I had pretty low self-esteem at that moment, but I knew I could do that. I could go to the Fillmore and write my opinion of Savoy Brown. And so I kept nagging them to let me do that, saying, oh, I wrote for the school paper and all that. And then they would assign me things that nobody else wanted to cover. So I had a freelance relationship as a writer. They'd pay me 30 cents an inch, which would mean like maybe $10 for a typical review, because an inch was an inch of print in the magazine, not an inch that I gave them. And you know, I actually got to review the Woodstock Festival for Billboard because no one wanted to go. And you know, and then once you have a byline, you're a writer. And I kept copies of those pieces and made photocopies of them, and showed people I was a writer, and then I started writing for other people for a few years. I couldn't really make it as a writer, so after about 3 years of different gigs, and not getting one of the gigs that I really would have loved, like writing about music for the New York Times, I gave in and decided to become a publicist. And I went from being a pretty average music writer to being a really, really good publicist.
Okay. Just to go back before I start, I love the way you just dropped in the fact that you were there as a writer for Woodstock. You know, it's kind of, it's like, I mean, like, I suppose it's fascinating that you say that there wasn't many people that wanted to kind of to go. You know, that it wasn't.
Well, none of the older writers wanted to go. It was a generational thing. I mean, if the older writers wanted to go to and cover shows where you got free drinks, those were the prized assignments, which I could never get. But to go and watch a concert up in the country, these were guys that were old, meaning in their 30s. You know. You know, and you know, if you weren't of a certain generation, you really didn't care about Hendrix, and if you were of that generation, oh my God, how could I see Hendrix?
Yeah. And was that I mean, stupid question, but was that an amazing? Did it feel amazing when you were there? Did it have that sense?
It was. I mean, it was amazing for, you know, obviously the musicians were some of the great musicians of their time, Johnny Winter and the Who, and I love Joan Baez, was a folk fan also, and Hendrix, of course, Sly and the Family Stone, and you know, but the crowd was amazing. You know, I had really fallen in love with the whole hippie idea. I wrote a book about it actually a few years ago that was published called "In Search of the Lost Chord, 1967," and the hippie idea. And I by that time I wasn't doing drugs anymore. I'd gotten into trouble and just knew I couldn't do drugs and function. But I loved the sense of brotherhood, sisterhood. Love. People were so sweet to each other. It was everything that mythology says it was in terms of the feeling in that massive crowd. And that's what I remembered.
Yeah.
And took with me more than the music. Although obviously now the movie's been around for 50 years and I know the music through the movie, not through my own memory. except for Johnny Winter, because he wasn't in the movie, and I remember how great he was in real life. So that's the one memory that I know is actually mine. I'm
Yeah.
not seeing the movie.
And as a publicist, then, I mean, you said you kind of seem to have found, one of your niches. You said it moved you into a more confident place, but also you started to work with Zeppelin then around that time as well, didn't you? Was that around then?
Well, that's once I got a PR job in January of '73. I started working for a company called Salters and Roskin. They were an old show business company. They represented Barbra Streisand and Frank Sinatra Broadway shows. And the guy who ran it, named Lee Salters, wanted a younger guy with long hair who understood this rock and roll thing, because that was a new source of business.
Yes.
So I went to work for him, and within about 3 months later, he comes up to me and he says, "Do we want Led Zeppelin as a client?" Because the business guy, the lawyer, had contacted him as a name brand publicist. I said, yes, we do. He says, well, you better come with me to the meeting, because I don't know anything about that music. I'm the Guy Lombardo generation. So they flew us to Paris to see the band at the Palais de Sport, and met them afterwards, and met Peter Grant. And from that day, I was Zeppelin's publicist. Lee just went to that first meeting and never saw them again, because they understood they wanted the so-called clout of the PR firm, which was real. I had access to people by being there, but they wanted the person who, was of that generation, music and stuff. So within a few months of being a publicist, I was Zeppelin's publicist, and that really changed my whole career. To this day, people ask me about Zeppelin.
And you also have said, in kind of reading a few previous interviews you've done, and you talked about the fact that Peter Grant kind of revolutionized a lot of relationships between, say, bands and promoters and venues, but also that you kind of a great training ground for you in relation to your future career as well.
And today, there's no question. I mean, he was the first. I had known one other manager when I was a publicist, Steve Paul, who managed Johnny Winter and Edgar Winter, and he was also a friend of mine. So he was a real role model just in terms of his work ethic. He was so weird and free associating and cosmic, but he had this book where he wrote everything down and made lists and did everything on the list, and showed me that no matter how weird you wanted to be, if you were going to function, you needed a certain organized approach to what you were doing. But Peter Grant, I worked with much more closely. I worked only for Peter Grant for several years, and he was this fierce advocate for the band. I mean, everybody in the British music business refers to him as someone who changed the rules, where he got artists a much higher percentage of concert profits, and was very aggressive with the record companies, because he understood the power of the artist relative to everybody else in the business in a way that his peers hadn't. And to me, just being around him for that period of time, I internalized that attitude: is all that matters is, what does the band want? We represent the band, the heck with everybody else. And not to go out of your way to offend other people, but to understand your priorities. So I internalized that attitude, and that's informed everything I've done as a manager since then. He was a great role model in terms of that attitude and that aspect. So he had very different backgrounds. He was British, I was American. He was older. He wasn't a big reader. He came from poor neighborhoods, but incredibly smart. And his approach and his understanding of the role of a manager was what I took from him, and still to this day think in terms of that.
I mean, as a young man as well, it must have been incredibly exciting to be around. I mean, like, Zeppelin were at the top of the game then. That was and those concerts are now legend. That's what I say. Them must have been incredible. To have been there at the age you were at.
It was exciting. I mean, I was a little old, even at the age of 22, 23, compared to their core audience. So they weren't one of my favorite artists until I started working with them.
Yeah.
Or for them, obviously. Because I was of the generation where Dylan was my guy, and Cream was the British blues influenced band that I listened to when I got stoned in high school. But I became a fan of Zeppelin once I went to a number of their shows, and I admired them so much for the way they carried themselves. And the most amazing thing was the level of intensity and love from those fans. Was really I'd never been around that before. So yeah, it was exciting. I mean, I was so busy just every day trying to not make anybody mad at me. Meaning I didn't want anybody in the band mad at me, and I especially didn't want Peter Grant mad at me. that was really, I was just sort of thinking day to day how to stay out of trouble with my bosses. But I knew it was. I knew they were the biggest band in the world. I didn't know I'd be talking about them 50 years later, but I knew it was a possibility.
Yeah. And did you have a sense then of, like, was management becoming something that you wanted to get in?
Yeah, once I saw Peter, he was such a powerful figure. The way Ahmet Ertegun, the head of Atlantic, deferred to him, the way the promoters, Bill Graham, people that I idolized, still were sucking up to Peter because he was Zeppelin's manager. And he had the relationship with the band. He was the one that they trusted. And I romanticized the artists. I still romanticize artists. They can do something amazing that I can't do, and that bring a lot of light and beauty into the world. And so that just seemed to me like the job that I wanted. It took me quite a long time to convince any artist to let me be their manager. It took me about another, 7 or 8 years before that could become a real part of my career. But yes, once I worked for them, that was, in those days, that was my goal. I had a period later on in my career where I ran record companies, and I'm really glad I got to do that. But my original notion was to be a manager. Yeah.
Yeah.
Once I was around a successful manager. Yeah.
And so, like, the pathway to that, I mean, like I just say, how did you back in the day convince, or build up the machine, or the small machine that could build big, like with the Gold Mountain Entertainment Company? That kind of started early 80s, was it? Kind of.
Yeah, I don't know, man. It's just continually trying. Only something worked. The initial thing I was able to do after I left Zeppelin, which I worked for them for 3 years, and then in the midway through '76, we had a parting of the ways. So that was, they'd recorded the album. It was called Presence, but it hadn't come out yet. So I was there through the recording of it, but not for the release of that. I'd worked with them on Physical Graffiti and Houses of the Holy. Those were the 2 albums where I was worked for them. And so I immediately got publicity clients. That was what I could do right away. I wanted to be a publicist and a manager, but there was no interest in me being anyone's manager.
Yeah.
But there was immediate interest in me. The guy that had been Zeppelin's publicist, that was a good credit.
Yeah.
So I got, for example, Kiss right away, the minute I was available, because they emulated Zeppelin and idolized them. And they were very, very big then, by this time. And I got Electric Light Orchestra right away. Don Arden also had paid a lot of attention to Peter Grant. Peter Grant had worked for him. Don Arden was another very tough British manager, but nice to me. So I had this PR company for a few years, hoping that, and then I kept telling people I was interested in management. And then finally, by the end of the 80s, I got a client. I got to manage a band called Mink DeVille. The A&R guy who signed them was named Ben Edmonds, worked for Capitol, and he'd been a rock writer. So he knew me, when I had been editor of Circus magazine. I had assigned him pieces. He knew me personally, and he thought maybe I'd be good for the band. So that was the first act I actually managed. And they're a great band. I mean, Willie DeVille had personal problems, widely documented, and died young. But I worked with them on their first 2 albums. Very proud to work with them in terms of the live shows and the music. But it was another several years before I really was able to build the company that you described, Gold Mountain. That became a thing in the second half of the 80s. So again, from my early 20s to my late 30s, I was striving. It was a 15-year period, and then finally, in the second half of the 80s, I really had success. Bonnie Raitt was one of our clients, and she won the Grammy for Best Album. So that's when I really kind of was taken, quote unquote, seriously as a manager, was that period. Maybe a couple of years before, because Belinda Carlisle had a big hit in America. But, it was more than a decade of wanting to be a manager before I really actually was doing it in any way that could be considered successful.
And then, I mean, I suppose what's interesting through reading about you and reading some of your book kind of before I went to chat to you was about you mentioned the romanticism, but I kind of classify it as like you really have the artist. You come across as a man who has an artist soul or creative soul. Like you kind of really, the empathy with the artist is kind of clear in relation to the way you talk about it, the way you write about it, and seems to be a driving force throughout.
really admire. I mean, you know, I'm in the middle of thinking about a new book about the relationship between art and politics in America this year, and I really look up to artists. I think they provide something so special in the world, not just rock and roll artists, but you know, poets and filmmakers and painters. You know, I know rock and roll is an art form better than most other forms, but yeah, that's kind of been you know. The way I grew up, my parents were interested in literature, music, and politics. Same interests that I have today. So I rebelled against them in the sense that they didn't really like it when I dropped out of college and, you know, got arrested at 17 for violating various drug laws. But I was a lot more like them once I straightened myself out than I wanted to admit to myself for quite a long time. You know?
Yes. And then I suppose, you know, triple into Carlisle and Wainwright and kind of more and more bands, and you kind of Sonic Youth then were kind of when you're also.
Well, what happened is, yeah, I started this management company called Gold Mountain, which is just another way of saying Goldberg, you know, and was based in Los Angeles by that time, although we kept the New York office. Belinda was one of the first clients, and that was an immediate success. She'd been the lead singer of the Go-Go's, and her solo album was the one solo album that was a hit of the ex-Go-Go's. And then I had Bonnie, and then with Belinda and Bonnie, it was like, oh, I'm a successful manager now. And I realized that I was getting into my late 30s, 40 was coming up quite soon, and I was out of touch with people 20 years younger, of course, the way we all get. And I was aware that there was this new generation of people influenced by punk rock. And in America, it wasn't so much the Sex Pistols and the Clash, although they're legendary influences. It was the 80s American punk rockers like Black Flag and the Dead Kennedys were informing this kind of new generation of indie, almost all on indie labels, and you know, an alternative to what was now 20 or 30 years of what came to be called corporate rock.
Yeah.
And I knew I didn't have the ears for it, but I wanted to get into it. I liked what I was feeling about the energy of it, and it was obviously a future commercial thing. So I hired a young guy named John Silva, who at that time, now he's a very successful manager. He has the Foo Fighters and many, many other big artists. At that time, he needed a job so he could get his own apartment. And he had a couple of good artists, but they weren't making any money. And so I brought him in, and our goal was to then sign a bigger alternative artist that would give us some credibility to really be a force in this subgenre. And Sonic Youth became available within a few months. And I was able to get us a meeting with them, and then it was a perfect situation. I mean, John knew all of their music. I knew none of it. I just knew they were cool. He had all the vinyl 7-inches and read the fanzines, and you know, had a deep, deep knowledge of the culture that Sonic Youth cared about. And I had kind of the music industry cred that they needed at that time, because they had signed their first major label deal with Geffen Records and didn't want to navigate the release of that record without somebody on their side that knew the business. And so they liked us. And then once we had Sonic Youth, instant credibility in the subculture, because Thurston Moore and Kim Gordon and the other members of the band were so revered for their taste, not only for being a great band, but for being kind of curators of the whole culture. So many artists got careers because they were the opening act to Sonic Youth. And one of those artists was Nirvana. You know, and I heard about Nirvana from Thurston Moore, Sonic Youth, and from John. And, you know, I didn't really like new acts, because when you take on a new act, you don't get paid anything for the first year or two. And I was like a small businessman worried about meeting the payroll. And, you know, in America, you've got to pay for their health insurance and the rent. And, you know, so I wanted people that could like make money. But Thurston said, look, I know you don't like new bands, because I passed on Dinosaur Jr. for exactly this reason, who I still think are great, but it was the right thing business-wise to pass on them at that time. And so I totally trusted him, and they trusted him also. Yeah. So we had one meeting, and we're their manager.
Yeah, and I mean, it's phenomenal. Kind of a phenomenon is an apt word in a way, because it's kind of very easy to look back now in the age of social media and the age of kind of streaming and in the age of, but you know, obviously Nirvana had releases before they came, under your wing, but there was stuff that kind of just exploded. It was just, it was.
Well, I think that music is the most powerful connector. It's not about whether it's delivered over on a cell phone or Spotify, or whether you buy it on a disc, or whether you hear it on the radio. It's the way music travels person to person. So, obviously the Beatles happened extremely quickly. In America, they were on one TV show, and the next day they were the biggest band in America. They already had been big in England, but there were a lot of other bands that were big in England that never made it in America. And, the same thing was true with kind of any of these hits that would just suddenly, you hear Brown Eyed Girl on the radio, and who's that? And then you go to every party and they're playing Brown Eyed Girl. So there are certain songs that are so magical, that they travel so fast, that even before the digital age, that still would happen every once in a while. And Nirvana was one of those times. It was accelerated by that time. The big technology that added another level to them was music video, because MTV had just started a few years earlier, and music video globally had become like a big connector only a few years earlier. So that accelerated the intensity of the relationship between a fan and a new artist and a new song, because you're not only hearing that song, you're seeing that video, and the video of Smells Like Teen Spirit was brilliant. I had nothing to do with it. It was Kurt's idea, and he oversaw every aspect of it, and terrific people worked on it. But that kind of made a whole statement all of its own. So it was incredibly fast how quickly that song became a global kind of anthem, and the album became kind of either number one or top five everywhere in the world where people bought Western music. It happened, the album came out at the end of September, and by the end of the year, it was a phenomenon, certainly in Western Europe, the UK, and in the United States. And, really, we knew within a couple of weeks that it was very, very powerful. We didn't know exactly where it was going to end up, but the level of intensity of the response, pretty much something gets played on the radio, you get instant response.
Yeah.
So even though there was no internet, there was the radio, and word traveled incredibly fast about that song.
I said I'm kind of midway through your book. It's a beautifully written book, Serving the Servant, and I think there's. I love the title. It says it's brilliantly put, actually, but I also was really caught by the way you talk about that time, but by the way you talk about the legacy, and by the way you kind of talk about your relationship with Kurt, and I suppose in some ways your relationship with his memory. Do you know what I mean? That it's kind of, you talk an awful lot about the fun side, because it's all around the world. The newspapers were filled with obviously the man's dark side and tragic side. But you mentioned there about the making of Smells Like Teen Spirit video, and the artistry of the man beyond what people might have thought.
Yeah, well, I really did love him, and it was also the high point of my career working with him. And it had been in the back of my mind for a while that his image, his death was so tragic and so grotesque, and there were enough photos of him looking out of it that I felt, and different things that had come out about him, I thought had disproportionately emphasized his self-destructive side, and insufficiently focused on his brilliant creative side, which obviously is the only reason anyone cared about the tragic side. There, unfortunately, thousands and thousands of people kill themselves every year, but there's only one Kurt Cobain, So I just thought, and I had these memories, and I knew it was the 25th anniversary. The book came out in 2019, the first version of it, because it was the 25th anniversary of his death. And, I'd written this other book, for a lot of things combined to make me want to write it. And once I decided to write it, it was clear to me that was my contribution. There's a lot of other books about Kurt and about Nirvana by some very good writers, some of them who knew him quite well. For example, Everett True's book, a British journalist, and Michael Azarat's book. Those are two two journalists that knew him very, very well, and Charles Cross, who, was given access by Courtney to an enormous amount of material. So there's several very good books about the band, but nobody who worked with him had written a book. And I thought that I could show that side that you alluded to, how brilliant he was. He was such a genius. He wrote the lyrics, he wrote the music, he controlled the production of the records, he storyboarded the videos, he designed the album covers, and he understood with granular detail every aspect of how to connect with fans. Every interview was like a work of art. Every time he took a photo, he knew the camera was there and he would look different and what T-shirt he was wearing, so that side of him was amazing. I mean, it didn't make him quote unquote happy, except for brief periods of time, because he had other demons that, unfortunately ended up shortening his life. But when it came to his art, he was incredibly focused and incredibly brilliant. So yeah, I do focus on that, and hopefully it's a good contribution to the information and about him. It's just my perception. There's other. He showed a little something different to everybody. A lot of these genius types do, it's Bob Marley or Dylan. Different people have different experiences. Mine were very positive with him.
Yeah, but it also seemed as well, that I presume for you, it was kind of a, because, from reading about you and from reading the book, you had a close relationship with him, where you were kind of his guy, there was a, and I suppose you mentioned as well the fact that you felt older, at that.
I didn't feel, I was older. It wasn't just a feeling. I was 15 years older. 17 years older. Yeah, he was born in 67. So.
Yeah. But it's interesting that the music harks back in that time, like Nirvana in particular, but not just Nirvana. It really harked back. You mentioned the punk kind of era, but also with the punk era, the knowing relationship between the artist and the fan, and the leveling of that. For some people saw it as anarchy. It was like pulling down those walls between the fans and the musicians being aware that they were
right. I think that's right. I think look, I don't think he was the first artist, nor do I think that generation of punk were the only people to ever do that. I mean, I think the Grateful Dead had a lot of the same attitude about a transparency and an intimacy with their fans, for example.
Yeah.
But he certainly he prized. I think there was one interview he gave where he said, "Well, what can other bands learn from Nirvana?" And he says, "If they learn one thing, I hope they learn sincerity."
Yeah.
And I think he meant that. Kurt could often be ironic, sarcastic, and oblique, but he sometimes could just be straightforward. And I felt that was something he actually meant, that he was being sincere when he said it.
Yeah. I mean, the joy of an awful lot of young people and not so young people around the world that kind of found with Nirvana and with kind of other bands around that period, and then the trauma of it was like a John Lennon moment, of like when an icon kind of left, and also because you mentioned the sincerity piece, because people connected with him in a way that was beyond a picture on the wall,
Yeah, there were these artists through the years that develop a deeper relationship with their fans. Certainly Dylan, to a lot of people of my generation, to me, had that. John Lennon did, Bob Marley did, and Kurt's definitely on that list. I think Aretha Franklin did in a different way. So he's on a short list of artists that achieved a connection on multiple levels. The music being the doorway, but then a set of values and a certain attitudes, especially about masculinity. It was such a macho time in rock and roll, and he was such a in terms of commercial rock and roll, and he really gave another way of being a man. I think when I was researching the book, just going on some of the message boards, there are these fan message boards, and a lot of the comments were from men who said that it really showed them a different way of thinking about themselves and what it was to be a man, and that was something he thought about. He was one of the great ones, no question about it. I'm lucky I got to work with him.
And for you, then, kind of around that, wasn't still through the Nirvana years that you became CEO of Atlantic, wasn't that around the...
Well, I went through a lot of jobs, no question about that. And yeah, after Nirvana made it, I had my first kid, our daughter Katie, who was born in 1990, and so she was just 4 years old when Kurt died. But somewhere in there, when she was around 2, I just realized the idea of running a small business. It was 7 days a week. It was so much pressure. I knew there was an uncertainty about the commercial future of Nirvana. I had no doubt about the creative genius of Kurt, but and I just felt that I should try to get a real job. And what better time than when I had this enhanced reputation because I was basking in the glow of what they did. So I got a job for Atlantic Records. Initially, the title was Senior Vice President for the West Coast as an A&R job, and then I had a feeling if I did a good job, I could be promoted to president because of things that were happening in the corporation that happened. So then I was promoted to president, and then later, and that started kind of a 6-year period where I, really an 8 or 9 year period where I ran record companies.
Yeah, you did run record companies.
It's a whole other chapter. Again, that's the thing. Being around for a while, you have these different chapters.
I mean, just like from your career thus far, like having all the sides of it. You know what I mean? It's kind of journalist, the PR. Then there's the manager, and then there's kind of driving the bus. That sense of that were the moments when you were kind of in those offices going, okay, now I'm kind of here.
Well, I mean, there's been moments every day of my life where I felt that, including right now. But I always had this irrational confidence that some people would call arrogance or delusion, that I knew what to do, and I often didn't know what to do. I made an extraordinary number of mistakes and was certainly not very sophisticated at dealing with sort of what people would call corporate politics, because I kept thinking of myself as an outsider, which you really can't do when you have these senior jobs. But I just tried to do what was in front of me. I mean, and that's still kind of the way I approach it. It's such a mystery to me. I'm so grateful for this career, but a lot of it seemed to have happened by some other design than my own. And I just try to, in any given moment, be positive and learn from the many, 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 many mistakes that I've made along the way.
And was there a particular trigger to kind of bring you back into, like, after years being the top honcho in the huge record companies?
Well, getting fired was a huge trigger from several jobs. That's always sort of a wake up call that I guess I have to find something else to do. And when it was, there's there are some executives that stay current for 50 years. I mean, Clive Davis is a famous American example of that. But a lot of people are associated with a certain kind of music, a certain period of time. Yeah. And I never really internalized the hip hop business. I admire and honor its contribution to the culture. And that became more and more dominant. Rock and roll became a smaller piece of the commercial pie. I just was, the distance between Nirvana's success kept getting greater every day. And suddenly 10 years passed, 15 years passed. And I just, it was just clear to me that I wasn't going to get another offer to run a record company, but I still loved the music business, didn't really know another business. I wanted to go back to writing, as I've been doing the last 10 years, but so starting a management company seemed like something I could do without having to find an investor or write a business plan if I could get a client. And fortunately, around that time, Steve Earle, who I had worked with in one of my label jobs, I'd made several records with him. I had a label called Artemis Records that eventually went under, but was an indie label that had some success for a while. And he called me and said he had a falling out with his manager and was looking for somebody, and who would I suggest? And I said, well, I'm thinking of, I was doing something else that I knew had a short lifespan. I said, I'm thinking of starting being a manager again myself, but I'll let you know what ideas I have. And he called me back a few hours later and said, look, if you're in, I'm in. And so that was 15 years ago, and I still manage him, and one of the great artists I've been privileged to work with. So it just was the only thing I knew how to do. And as long as I can find artists like him and like the Waterboys and Mike Scott and Martha Wainwright to work with, and they want me to do it, and I could still be of some use, I still think it's an honorable way to make a living, and I get to work with people I really look up to.
Yeah, yeah. And in relation to the writing, I mean, obviously you still practice hugely in relation to writing. You published like lots of articles, books, but I'm interested in, is that something that kind of still, like, the journey back to write the book about Kurt, obviously the very personal, very personal exploration for yourself. But now this kind of new book that you're kind of toying around with, or the idea of
Well, what happened is things, one of the things in the music business, or probably any kind of entertainment or arts businesses, there are times when you're hot and there are times when you're cold. And there, at a certain point, around 15 years ago, I was entering the first of what would become several cold periods, and wrote the first book, and then a few years ago, and then then I wrote another one. The first one was 2005. The second one, which was a rock memoir called Bumping Into Geniuses, came out in 2009. The first one was about kind of similar to the theme I'm doing now, but it was through the prism of the 90s, about the relationship between culture and politics, looking at the 80s and 90s, and some experiences I'd had when I lived in Los Angeles. And then I did the 60s, and then starting a few years ago, when I've been doing this company, I just realized, look, I have a certain amount of time left, and there's only, this management business is what it is. It's been pretty much the same size now for 10 years. I do the best I can with it. The clients always come first. Those are the first emails I answer and the first calls I return. But I had some extra time, and thank God I started doing this, because during this COVID quarantine period, obviously there's been no concerts and less quote-unquote management work to do. We still do it. We're still working every day. But I just developed this real love of writing. And it's become a part of how, when I wake up in the morning, I look at myself, and it gives me something to do. I hope I get so busy in the music business that I don't have time to write any more books. But I'm going to finish the one I'm doing now. That's for sure. I deadline on March 1st. And, then once we get into next summer, touring is back, and I get so busy that I can't write for a few years. That would be fine. But I do love doing it. It was what I started out wanting to do. And when I was younger, I was so worried about meeting girls and getting ahead in the world. And I found it much harder to concentrate. And now I can actually, I couldn't have written books when I was in my 20s and 30s. I didn't have the ability to concentrate. A lot of things I don't like about getting older, such as putting on weight. But I do like that about getting older. I'm able to concentrate in the way that I couldn't when I was younger. So I'm going to keep writing as long as someone wants to read it, or as long as I have something to say, but only when I have the free time relative to my other obligations.
Yeah. And Kumar, before I let you go, it's interesting in the book you're writing now, and the comparison between, say, politics and culture back in the 90s to now. I mean, do you feel that there is that kind of symbiotic relationship still there, or has it changed? Or
well, it's the thing that I keep coming back to, is there are some things that are completely different. I mean, obviously, the digital world has just radically changed every aspect of society, including politics. The demographics of the United States are very different, and the media is very different, and the people are different that are the individual people. But the certain basic moral, spiritual questions that artists grapple with and that the politicians are supposed to address are remarkably similar. So, I'm reading a book right now called Reaganland by a terrific American political historian named Rick Perlstein, which is about sort of the 5 years leading to Ronald Reagan becoming president, and reading about some of the arguments between the ascendant right wing in America in the 70s. And oh my goodness, so much about race. You know, Reagan was complaining about voting by mail. I mean, a remarkable similarity to some of the certain cosmic arguments that have been going on for decades or centuries, and that artists have also been addressing on a parallel track. And every once in a while, the artistic vision of kind of what it is to be a human being dovetails with political reality, and artists become more engaged. In America during the Trump era, it's unprecedented, the level of engagement of artists, because first of all, he came out of reality television. So he's kind of a product of show business. Secondly, he was such a step backwards as a public figure in terms of issues of race and gender, especially, that are so important to a lot of the creative community. And it just the emergence of Twitter, where somebody like Taylor Swift can reach a lot more people than any political journalist with a couple of tweets, change the playing field in certain ways. And I don't think there's hardly a comedian in the United States that doesn't have jokes or commentary about Donald Trump as part of their act. I mean, hundreds of them. That was not the case in this late 60s, for example. There were politically active artists in the late 60s, but only a few of them. Now it's like part of being an artist for 75% of them. So I'm trying to document that. I don't know whether it'll be any good or not, but I'll meet my deadline and it'll come out. That I can tell you.
Come here, before I leave you, just one question, and I kind of I've picked it up from the book Servant, but I'm really interested in what your long-standing memories are of Kurt and that time for you.
Well, when someone is that famous, it's so hard to differentiate, again, what are my memories? What is just a story I've told 20 times before? What did somebody else tell me? The passage of time is not kind to my ability to remember things, but I remember his smile. I remember this beautiful look in his eyes when he smiled, and looking into those blue eyes, it was such a force of love and a powerful energy behind it. And that's the way I want to remember him. I can never forget his death. I can never forget his deep unhappiness in the weeks leading up to it and other times in his life. But that's not the only thing I remember about him. And the music itself obviously has its own presence in the world. It's not just for me, but certain songs still mean a lot to me. But I do, when you really boil it down, when it's just in the privacy of my thoughts, that smile is kind of what stays alive inside my head.
Yeah. Look, Danny, thanks so much. I mean, it's one thing kind of chatting to you. I mean, the career you've had so far is just extraordinary.
I have one thing I need to add. The Waterboys have a new album.
Well, I was going. You actually got there before me. One of my favorite bands of all times is the Waterboys, and the main reason we're chatting now is because of the Waterboys. Mike Scott is kind of a touchstone for me throughout my kind of culture and artistic life. So yes, they have a really, really special one. Really, really special. As a Waterboys fan for many years, I didn't think the man had more turns in him, but he absolutely has. Do you find when you're around that type of work and new work emerging, Danny, do you get a sense of excitement still? Around.
I do. I get excited when I hear a new songs by the people I work with. I only work with 5 artists now. They're all very special to me, and I can do a good job if I'm not excited. When I was running big record companies, of course, I couldn't be equally excited about hundreds of different artists. But this kind of work, management, and this phase of my career, it's very much driven by that emotion, and trying to then use that enthusiasm to try to help, the agenda of the artists in the business world. So I do. I love these new songs, and I love the privilege of working with people that are so alive creatively. A lot of artists that make it in their 20s and 30s lose the thread as they go older, because so much of pop music is about youth. But there are a handful like Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan, Springsteen, and the people I work with that keep growing, and their art keeps growing with it, but it still has that same level of intensity. Not everybody has that talent, but some people do, and boy, those are my favorite artists.
Yeah, I mean, and as you say, you like the likes of Mike and then the Waterboys and Martha Wainwright and Steve. I mean, they're yeah, I suppose they explorers in music. Let's say. I mean, their career is about way more than putting out albums.
Well, I think they're all listening to their own muse and those particular artists and others who I admire are interdirected. They're listening to a muse. They're alive in the world, and the art comes first. And then, of course, they want to be successful. Everybody likes to be successful if you're in the public eye, and everybody has to make a living and be compensated correctly. But the origin of the work comes from the purest kind of search for a new artistic moment. So yeah, not every successful performer does that. But again, the people I admire the most do that, and certainly the people that I'm working with now, I'm lucky enough to have a few of them who are that way, and it's really inspiring, and it makes me feel better about getting older too.
And Danny, how did the Waterboys happen for you? How did that kind of connect?
Well, we met through. There's a long-time agent named Paul Charles who's booked the Waterboys concerts in Europe, and at some point several years ago, he asked me if I was interested in meeting Mike, and I jumped at the opportunity, and it grew out of that.
Yeah, because there's a thread, there's a thread looking from, a narrative thread looking back from the artists that you were kind of around back in the '60s to the likes of
No question about it. No question about it. It's part of the same tradition of trying to make rock and roll as wide and meaningful and deep as possible, while still fun and entertaining.
Yeah.
And it's a trick that only a few have been able to pull off.
Yeah.
Thank God for them.
Well, thank God for you facilitating them, being able to do more of it and getting more of it out. Listen, Camille, thanks so much for taking part in this. It's been a great honor to talk to you, and good luck in the future.
Thank you, brother. Later.
See you.